The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Westfield Country Club's bridal suite, sending crystal fragments skittering across Italian tile like fallen stars. I stared at the puddle of Dom Perignon soaking into my wedding dress train, the one I'd spent 18 months saving for, the one that cost more than my car payment. Above the mess, Patricia Manning stood with her arms crossed, her Botoxed face twisted into something that might have been a smile if smiles could draw blood. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. "The wedding is off, Allison," she announced, her voice cutting through the pre-ceremony chaos like a scalpel through silk. "I've already spoken with the vendors." 3 hours. 3 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle and marry her son David Manning, the man I'd loved for 4 years, the man who'd proposed to me on a beach in Malibu while fireworks painted the Pacific sky in gold and emerald. 3 hours before 200 guests would watch me promise forever to someone whose mother had just detonated my entire world with the casual indifference of someone canceling a dentist appointment. The bridal suite fell silent, except for the distant sound of string quartet warming up in the garden pavilion. My maid of honor, Jessica, stood frozen with a makeup brush halfway to my cheek, her mouth forming a perfect O of disbelief. My sister Carmen dropped the bouquet of white peonies she'd been adjusting, petals scattering across the Persian rug like confetti at a funeral. "What do you mean?" I whispered, the words scraping my throat raw. Patricia smoothed her navy Chanel suit, the one that probably cost more than most people's rent. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting tiny rainbows across the destruction she'd just unleashed. "I mean exactly what I said, dear. This circus ends today." She pulled out her phone, a rose gold iPhone with a case that matched her manicured nails, and began scrolling through what I could only assume were the text messages she'd sent to destroy my wedding. "The caterers have been dismissed. The florists are packing up. The photographer has been paid for his inconvenience. Even that ridiculous DJ you insisted on has been sent home." My hands started shaking, not the delicate bridal nerves I'd expected to feel on my wedding day, but the bone-deep tremor of someone watching their life implode in real time. "You can't just cancel my wedding. This isn't your decision to make." Patricia's laugh was like ice cubes clinking in crystal. "Oh, but it is, sweetheart. You see, when you're paying for the venue, the vendors, the flowers, the food, and everything else that makes this little fantasy possible, you absolutely get to make that decision." The room spun slightly. I reached for the velvet ottoman behind me, a designer wedding dress pooling around my feet like spilled milk. David's father paid for the wedding. "Did he?" Patricia tilted her head, studying me like I was an interesting but ultimately disappointing science experiment. Because last I checked, Charles had a sudden change of heart about funding this particular investment. Funny how these things happen. Jessica finally found her voice, though it came out as a squeak. "Mrs. Manning, there are 200 people here. The ceremony starts in 3 hours. You can't just—" "I can, and I have." Patricia's attention shifted to my maid of honor with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. "The guests are being informed as we speak. Something about the bride having cold feet. Very relatable, really. These young marriages rarely work out anyway." Cold feet? She was telling everyone I'd gotten cold feet. 4 years of planning, of dreaming, of building a life with David, and she was reducing it to pre-wedding jitters. The humiliation burned in my chest like acid. "Where's David?" I managed to stand, though my legs felt like they were made of the same fragile crystal that now littered the floor. "Where is my fiancé?" Patricia's smile widened, revealing teeth so white they looked professionally bleached. "David understands that sometimes these things don't work out. He's handling the guest notifications in the groom suite. Very mature about it, actually. I raised him well." The words hit me like physical blows. David knew. David was helping her. My fiancé, the man who'd promised me forever just last night during our rehearsal dinner, was in another room telling our friends and family that his bride had chickened out. Carmen stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. This is insane. You can't destroy someone's wedding because you don't like them. Like has nothing to do with it, Patricia replied, adjusting her pearl earrings with the casualness of someone discussing the weather. This is about what's best for my family. David deserves someone from his own world, someone who understands the responsibilities that come with the Manning name. There it was, the real reason. Not cold feet, not sudden doubts, not even garden variety mother-in-law disapproval. This was about class, about money, about the fact that I'd grown up in a 3-bedroom ranch house in suburban Phoenix, while David had been raised in a Beacon Hill mansion with staff and trust funds and expectations I'd never fully understood. I met David during my junior year at Boston University. He was studying business while I was grinding through a marketing degree on academic scholarships and weekend jobs at coffee shops. He'd walked into the campus Starbucks where I was pulling espresso shots between classes, ordered a simple black coffee, and left a $20 tip with his phone number written on a napkin. Not because he was showing off, but because he'd noticed I'd been on my feet for 6 hours straight and thought I could use the gesture. That was David, thoughtful, kind, completely unaware of how his casual generosity could change someone's entire week. We'd started with coffee dates that turned into study sessions that became weekend adventures exploring Boston's hidden corners. He'd shown me speakeasies in Beacon Hill, and I'd introduce him to hole-in-the-wall taquerias in East Boston. For 4 years, it felt like we were building something real, something that transcended the obvious differences in our backgrounds. His father, Charles, had been welcoming, if somewhat distant, a software mogul who'd built his empire from a college dorm room and never quite lost the awkward charm of a reformed computer nerd. He'd made his billions developing cloud infrastructure for major corporations, then diversified into real estate, venture capital, and a dozen other investments that printed money while he slept. Charles treated me like an equal, asked about my marketing ideas, even offered me a position at one of his companies after graduation. But Patricia had been different from day one. Polite but cold, gracious but calculated. Every interaction felt like a test I was destined to fail. She'd correct my table manners at family dinners. She'd make comments about my quaint background whenever David wasn't within earshot. She'd suggest I might be more comfortable sitting with the other employees at company events rather than at the family table. I'd tried everything to win her over. I'd studied etiquette books, bought designer clothes I couldn't afford, even took French lessons because she'd mentioned that cultured women should speak at least 2 languages fluently. Nothing worked. If anything, my efforts seemed to amuse her, like watching a trained seal perform tricks for fish. "You're making a mistake," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "David loves me. This won't change that." Patricia's expression softened slightly, but not with warmth, with pity. "Oh, honey, you really don't understand, do you? David is a good boy. He follows the family plan, always has. And the family plan doesn't include a girl from Arizona with a state school education and dreams bigger than her trust fund." She moved toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble with military precision. "The car service will take you home. Your belongings from David's apartment have already been packed and will be delivered this evening. The engagement ring can be left on the dresser. Someone will collect it later." The engagement ring. The 2-carat princess-cut diamond that David had presented to me on one knee while the Pacific Ocean whispered our soundtrack. The symbol of promises that were apparently as fragile as the champagne flute now decorating the floor in 1,000 pieces. "This isn't over," I called after her, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. Patricia paused at the door, her hand resting on the gold-plated handle. "Yes, dear, it is." The door closed behind her with a whisper that sounded like the final page of a book being turned. Jessica and Carmen rushed to my side, their voices a blur of outrage and comfort, but I couldn't process their words. I was staring at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror that dominated one wall of the bridal suite. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. Hair swept into an elaborate updo that had taken 3 hours to perfect. Makeup applied by a professional who charged more for one morning than I used to make in a week. A dress that cost more than my college tuition. I looked like a Manning bride, exactly what Patricia had spent 4 years ensuring I could never truly become. But under all that carefully constructed perfection, under the designer facade and the borrowed elegance, I was still Allison Rodriguez from Phoenix, Arizona, the girl who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for college, the woman who'd built a successful marketing consultancy from nothing but determination and late nights, the person who'd never backed down from a fight in her life. Patricia Manning had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged, protected existence. She'd underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. She thought she was dismissing a social climber, a gold digger, a temporary inconvenience in her perfect family narrative. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who'd been fighting for everything she'd ever earned since the day she was born. And unlike Patricia, I didn't fight with lawyers and social pressure and family money. I fought to win. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The ride back to my apartment in Cambridge felt like a funeral procession for one. Jessica had insisted on coming with me, leaving Carmen to handle the aftermath at the country club, explaining to vendors, collecting wedding gifts, and somehow managing the social catastrophe that Patricia had orchestrated with surgical precision. The black town car that Patricia had arranged glided through Boston traffic in silence, the partition between us and the driver raised like a glass wall between my old life and whatever came next. I still wore the wedding dress, not by choice, but because the alternative was stripping down to my undergarments in front of strangers, and I'd already endured enough humiliation for one afternoon. The silk and lace that had felt like armor that morning now felt like a costume from a play that had closed mid-performance. Every stoplight brought stares from pedestrians who probably thought they were witnessing some romantic comedy moment, a runaway bride racing toward true love instead of away from it. Jessica kept shooting worried glances at me from the opposite seat. Her bridesmaid dress, a dusty rose silk number we'd spent weeks selecting, looked absurd in the back seat of what was essentially a very expensive getaway car. "Allie, you need to eat something, or drink water, or at least take off those heels before your feet go completely numb." I looked down at the Jimmy Choos that David had surprised me with last Christmas. 4-inch stilettos covered in crystals that caught light like tiny fireworks. They'd seemed perfect for dancing at my wedding reception. Now they just made my feet throb in rhythm with the headache building behind my eyes. "I can't feel my feet," I admitted, which was the first thing I'd said since leaving the country club. My voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else entirely. "That's the shock," Jessica said, her psychology degree from Tufts finally coming in handy. "Your body is protecting you from processing everything at once. It's actually pretty normal for trauma responses." Trauma? The word hit me sideways. I'd been thinking of this as betrayal, as humiliation, as the worst day of my life. But trauma suggested something deeper, something that would leave marks that makeup couldn't cover and time couldn't easily heal. The woman who'd woken up that morning as David Manning's fiancée, planning to become Mrs. Manning by sunset, no longer existed. Patricia had murdered her as efficiently as if she'd used an actual weapon. The town car turned onto my street in Cambridge, past the coffee shops and bookstores that had become the backdrop of my relationship with David. We'd walked these sidewalks thousands of times over 4 years. He'd carried my groceries when I was juggling too many client calls. I'd dragged him into vintage clothing stores where he'd patiently hold my purse while I searched for treasures among the racks of someone else's discarded dreams. Every familiar landmark felt like a memorial now. The Ethiopian restaurant where we'd had our first real fight about his mother's passive-aggressive comments at Christmas dinner. The park where he taught me to throw a football, laughing when my spiral looked more like a wounded duck.
The bench where we'd sat during the blizzard of 2019, sharing a thermos of spiked coffee and planning our future like it was something solid, something guaranteed. The driver pulled up in front of my building, a converted Victorian that had been carved into apartments for graduate students and young professionals who couldn't afford Boston proper but refused to live in the suburbs. It was charming in the way that old buildings with questionable heating and original hardwood floors could be charming. David had always loved visiting because it felt authentic, which I'd initially found endearing before realizing it was probably just another way of saying quaint. 3 cardboard boxes sat stacked beside my front door like a fortress of everything that had connected me to David Manning's world. Patricia hadn't been lying. Someone had already packed my life into shipping containers and delivered it like Amazon Prime, efficient and impersonal. Jessica paid the driver while I fumbled with my keys, the crystals on my dress catching the late afternoon sunlight and throwing rainbows across the weathered front door. My hands shook so badly that Jessica had to take the keys and unlock the door herself. "Come on," she said, guiding me inside like I was made of spun glass. "Let's get you out of that dress and figure out what happens next." My apartment felt smaller than usual, cramped with the weight of what had just happened. The walls were covered with photos of David and I, hiking in New Hampshire, at Red Sox games, celebrating my business landing its first major client. We looked happy in every picture, genuinely, stupidly happy, in the way that people in love always look to everyone else, like we'd solved some equation that the rest of the world was still working on. Jessica guided me to the couch while she examined the boxes Patricia's people had delivered. "It's mostly clothes," she reported, opening the first container. "Some books, that coffee mug you kept at his place, your spare phone charger." She held up my Boston University sweatshirt, the one I'd claimed from David's closet early in our relationship. I stared at the sweatshirt. It still smelled like David's cologne, the expensive stuff his mother bought him for birthdays because she believed scent was a reflection of character. I'd been wearing it just 2 nights ago when we'd stayed up late going over the seating chart for the reception, debating whether to put his college roommate next to my cousin Maria, or if that combination might result in inappropriate stories being shared during the toasts. "There's an envelope," Jessica said, pulling out a cream-colored piece of stationery that screamed expensive taste and old money. My name was written across the front in David's handwriting, the same careful script he'd used to sign our lease when we'd briefly talked about moving in together. I'd kept my apartment because Patricia had made it clear that proper young ladies don't cohabitate before marriage. At the time, I thought she was being old-fashioned. Now I realized she'd probably been planning this all along, making sure I'd have somewhere to return to when she eventually pressed the eject button on my relationship with her son. I opened the envelope with the same careful precision I'd used to everything in David's world, mindful of leaving fingerprints on things that weren't really mine to touch. "Allison," the letter began, and I could practically hear David's voice in the formal tone he used when he was uncomfortable. "I know today didn't go the way either of us planned, and I want you to know that this decision wasn't made lightly. My mother helped me realize that we want different things from life, and that's not anyone's fault. It's just the reality of who we are and where we come from. Different things from life. As if loving someone and building a future together were luxuries I couldn't afford rather than basic human desires. As if Patricia had performed some kind of intervention instead of a calculated assassination." "I've transferred $50,000 to your business account to help with any expenses you might have incurred preparing for today. I hope you understand that this is meant as support, not charity, and that it comes from a place of genuine care for your well-being and future success." $50,000. Blood money disguised as a generous gesture. Patricia had clearly coached him on how to frame the payoff, making it sound like an investment in my entrepreneurial dreams, rather than what it actually was, hush money to keep me quiet about how I'd been discarded like yesterday's newspaper. "I truly believe you're going to accomplish amazing things, Allison. You have more drive and determination than anyone I've ever met. I just don't think those amazing things are meant to happen to me." The letter was signed simply David. No love or fondly or even sincerely, Just his name, like he was endorsing a business contract rather than ending a 4-year relationship 18 hours before we were supposed to pledge our lives to each other. Jessica read over my shoulder, her breath catching when she reached the part about the money. 50 grand! Jesus, Allie, that's not exactly chump change. I folded the letter and set it on the coffee table next to the wedding planning binders that suddenly looked like artifacts from an archaeological dig, remnants of a civilization that had existed that morning but was now extinct. It doesn't matter, I said, and I was surprised to discover I meant it. This isn't about money. No, Jessica agreed, settling beside me on the couch. This is about power. About Patricia Manning deciding she could orchestrate people's lives like she was directing a play. Power. That was exactly what this was about. Patricia had wielded her influence like a surgeon's knife, precise and devastating. She'd probably started planning my elimination the moment David introduced me to the family. 4 years of strategy, 4 years of subtle undermining, 4 years of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Patricia Manning had made one crucial miscalculation in her campaign to remove me from her son's life. She'd assumed that destroying my relationship with David would be enough to neutralize me, that I'd slink back to Arizona with my tail between my legs and $50,000 in consolation prize money. She had no idea that David Manning, for all his charm and good intentions, had never been the real prize. The real treasure in the Manning family wasn't the heir apparent with his trust fund and his mother's expectations hanging around his neck like an anchor. It was Charles Manning, David's father, the self-made billionaire who'd built an empire from a college dorm room and a refusal to accept that some things were impossible. Charles, who'd treated me like family from the beginning. Charles, who'd valued my opinion and respected my work ethic and never once made me feel like I needed to apologize for where I came from. Charles, who had no idea what his wife had just done to the woman he'd welcomed into his family, the woman he'd been planning to officially call his daughter-in-law in approximately 6 hours. I stood up from the couch, my bare feet finally reconnecting with the ground beneath me. The wedding dress rustled around my ankles like autumn leaves, beautiful and dying all at once. "Jess," I said, my voice steady for the first time since Patricia's announcement, "I need you to help me out of this dress. Then I need to make a phone call." "Who are you calling?" I smiled, and it felt like the first genuine expression I'd worn all day. My father-in-law. The wedding dress hung in my closet like a ghost, wrapped in the clear plastic garment bag that the bridal shop had provided for preservation purposes. 3 days had passed since Patricia Manning's surgical strike against my future, and I hadn't called Charles, not yet. Not because I was afraid or uncertain, but because rage, properly channeled, required patience. I'd spent those 3 days doing something Patricia would never expect from someone she considered emotionally volatile and financially desperate. I'd been thinking, planning, researching. While she was probably celebrating her victory with champagne brunches and spa appointments, I was building a case that would make her regret every calculated move she'd made. Jessica had returned to her apartment in Somerville after the first night, convinced I was going to have some kind of breakdown that required professional intervention. Carmen had called twice daily from Phoenix, alternating between offering to fly out for moral support and suggesting various forms of revenge that ranged from juvenile to potentially criminal. Even my mother had reached out, her voice thick with the kind of disappointment that only came from watching your daughter's dreams get incinerated by someone else's cruelty. But I wasn't breaking down. If anything, I felt more focused than I had in years. The morning routine I developed was precise, almost meditative. Wake up at 6:30, coffee from the French press David had given me for my birthday, dark roast that could strip paint. Sit at my dining table with my laptop, surrounded by printed articles, financial reports, and legal documents that painted a picture Patricia Manning definitely didn't want anyone else to see. It turned out that when you know where to look, and when you have legitimate access to certain business databases through your marketing consultancy, you can learn fascinating things about people who believe they're untouchable. Patricia Manning wasn't just David's controlling mother and Charles's society wife. she was the shadow CEO of her own empire, a web of investments, charitable foundations, and business ventures that she'd been building for decades, while everyone assumed she spent her days organizing galas and getting facials. The woman was brilliant, calculating, and absolutely ruthless in ways that my wedding day assassination looked like amateur hour. She owned a controlling interest in a luxury hotel chain that catered to European tourists. She sat on the board of 3 different tech startups that Charles had funded through his venture capital firm. She'd personally brokered the deal that brought the Manning Family Foundation's headquarters to Boston, securing tax breaks that saved them millions while positioning herself as a civic leader. Most interestingly, she'd spent the last 5 years quietly acquiring residential properties throughout Beacon Hill and Back Bay, always through shell companies and legal trusts that the actual ownership nearly impossible to trace. Patricia Manning was a real estate mogul hiding behind charity luncheons and country club memberships. But every empire has a foundation, and every foundation has a weak point. Patricia's weakness was her pride. Specifically, her pride in the Beacon Hill townhouse that had been in her family for 4 generations, the same townhouse where she'd hosted David's engagement party, where she'd entertained senators and celebrities, where she'd built her reputation as Boston's most influential hostess. The townhouse, that according to public records I'd spent 2 days combing through, was mortgaged to the absolute limit. Not because Patricia couldn't afford the payments, but because she'd used the property as collateral for increasingly ambitious business ventures. Smart, aggressive leveraging that had paid off handsomely over the years. The kind of financial maneuvering that Charles probably admired and definitely didn't know the full extent of.
The mortgage holder? Manning Venture Capital, the investment firm Charles had founded 20 years ago and still controlled with an iron fist. Patricia had borrowed against her family's legacy property using her husband's own company as the lender. It was elegant, efficient, and completely dependent on Charles never having a reason to examine the loan terms too closely. Why would he? It was a family transaction, handled by lawyers and accountants who knew better than to question the personal financial arrangements of their most important clients. But loan agreements were contracts, and contracts had terms, and terms could be enforced by people who had legal authority to make those decisions. People like Charles Manning, who personally signed off on every major lending decision his company made. I closed my laptop and checked the time, 4:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, which meant Charles would be wrapping up his day at the downtown offices before heading home to Beacon Hill, home to Patricia, who was probably already planning her next charity event or her next business acquisition, secure in her belief that she'd successfully eliminated the threat to her family's social standing. She had no idea that the woman she'd dismissed as a gold-digging nobody from Arizona had spent the last 3 days building a dossier that could collapse her carefully constructed world with a single phone call. But I wasn't ready to make that call yet. Instead, I walked to my closet and stared at the wedding dress, still hanging in its plastic shroud like evidence from a crime scene. The dress that was supposed to transform me into Mrs. David Manning, acceptable wife material for one of Boston's most prominent families. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd been avoiding for 3 days. Not Charles Manning, not yet. This call was for someone else entirely. David Manning. His voice was professional, distant, the tone he used for business calls from numbers he didn't recognize. "It's me," I said. Silence stretched between us like a canyon. I could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of conversation that suggested he was somewhere public, probably leaving his office, probably heading home to his apartment that no longer contained any traces of my existence. Allison. My name sounded strange in his mouth. Careful and formal, like he was testing unfamiliar vocabulary. "How are you doing?" How was I doing? I was dissecting his mother's financial empire like a forensic accountant while wearing sweatpants and surviving on takeout Chinese food. I was discovering that the woman who destroyed my wedding had vulnerabilities that could be exploited with surgical precision. I was learning that revenge, properly planned, was an art form. "I'm fine," I said instead. "I got your letter. And the money." "Good, that's good. I wanted to make sure you were taken care of." Taken care of?
Like I was a problem that could be solved with a wire transfer and a carefully worded apology. Like 4 years of shared dreams could be settled with what was essentially a very generous severance package. I need to ask you something, I said, walking to my dining table where Patricia's financial secrets lay spread across the surface like tarot cards predicting someone's future. Did you know what your mother was planning? Another long silence. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She said you were having doubts, that you'd called her the night before and said you weren't sure about going through with it. The lie was so audacious, so completely fabricated, that I actually admired Patricia's commitment to her narrative. She'd convinced her own son that I'd been the one with cold feet, that she'd simply been protecting everyone involved from an awkward public disaster. And you believed her? I wanted to believe her, David admitted, because the alternative was that my mother had destroyed my wedding to protect me from making what she considered a mistake. And if that was true, then I'd have to choose between the woman I love and my family. And I've never been good at those kinds of choices. There it was. The truth that Patricia had counted on, the weakness she'd exploited with mathematical precision. David Manning, for all his good intentions and genuine affection, was fundamentally unable to stand up to his mother when it really mattered. He'd chosen the path of least resistance, accepted her version of events because it meant he didn't have to confront the reality of who his mother actually was. She played you, I said, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. She orchestrated the whole thing, David. The timing, the story, even this conversation we're having right now. She counted on you being too weak to fight for what you wanted. That's not fair, isn't it? He didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. I have to go, David said finally. I'm supposed to have dinner with my parents tonight. Mom's making her famous lamb Wellington. Of course she was. Patricia was probably already planning the celebration dinner, congratulating herself on removing the unsuitable girlfriend before she could become an unsuitable wife. Maybe she'll even invite some eligible alternatives, daughters of her country club friends who understand the importance of bloodlines and trust funds. David, I said before he could hang up, when you see your father tonight, tell him I said hello. What? Why?
But I'd already ended the call. I sat in my apartment as the sun set over Cambridge, painting my walls in shades of orange and gold that reminded me of the Arizona sunsets I'd grown up watching. Patricia Manning thought she'd won because she'd managed to separate me from her son, but she'd made the same mistake that powerful people always made. She'd assumed that the battle was about David, about marriage, about securing my place in a family that had never really wanted me anyway. She had no idea that David Manning had never been the real prize. The real power in that family belonged to Charles, and Charles Manning had spent 4 years treating me like the daughter he'd never had. He'd valued my opinions, supported my business dreams, and welcomed me into his world without conditions or expectations. Patricia had destroyed my relationship with her son, but she'd forgotten that some connections run deeper than romance. Some bonds are built on respect and genuine affection, and some people don't forget when someone they care about gets hurt. Tomorrow, I will call Charles Manning, not to ask for help, not to beg for intervention, but to tell him a story about his wife that he'd probably never heard before. And then Patricia Manning would learn what it felt like to have her carefully constructed world collapse around her with the same brutal efficiency she'd used to destroy mine. The wedding dress hung in my closet like a promise waiting to be kept. Cafe Luna in Harvard Square had been Charles Manning's choice for our Thursday afternoon meeting, which told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. Not his downtown office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and intimidating mahogany desk. Not the private club on Beacon Hill where he conducted his most sensitive business. A coffee shop frequented by graduate students and freelance writers, where conversations could be dismissed as casual encounters if anyone asked questions later. Charles Manning was a man who understood the importance of optics, especially when those optics might involve discussing his wife's business activities with the woman she'd just prevented from becoming his daughter-in-law.
I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances and enough ambient noise to mask our conversation from curious ears. The folder I'd brought contained 47 pages of financial documents, property records, and corporate filings that painted a picture of Patricia Manning's shadow empire. Not accusations or speculation, just facts compiled by someone who understood how to read between the lines of public records. Charles walked in exactly on time, wearing the kind of casual elegance that only came from having enough money to make expensive clothes look effortless. Dark jeans that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, a gray cashmere sweater that highlighted his silver hair, and the understated confidence of a man who'd built an empire from nothing and never forgot what that journey had cost him. He spotted me immediately, his expression carefully neutral as he approached the table. No surprise at seeing me, no visible emotion about the circumstances that had brought us here. Just the calculating assessment of a man who'd survived 4 decades in the tech industry by never showing his cards until he was ready to play them. Allison. He settled into the chair across from me with fluid grace, declining my offer to buy him coffee. You look well. It was a lie, and we both knew it. I looked like someone who'd spent 4 days processing the systematic destruction of her life plans while surviving on leftover Chinese food and righteous anger. But Charles Manning was nothing if not diplomatic. "Thank you for meeting with me," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "I know this situation is complicated." Charles studied my face with the same intensity he probably brought to evaluating potential investments, looking for tells, for weaknesses, for signs of what I actually wanted from this conversation. "David mentioned you'd called him yesterday, said you seemed to be handling everything with remarkable composure." Remarkable composure. That was one way to describe the cold fury that had replaced my initial shock and heartbreak. Patricia Manning had miscalculated badly if she thought destroying my wedding would leave me too devastated to think strategically. "I've had time to process what happened," I said, "and to do some research about why it happened." Something flickered behind Charles's eyes, not surprise, but recognition. The look of a chess player realizing his opponent had been studying the board more carefully than he'd assumed. "Research," he repeated, his tone carefully neutral. I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table. A property deed for 247 Beacon Street, the Manning family townhouse that had been Patricia's pride and joy for the 15 years she'd lived there. The deed showed a mortgage of $3.2 million against a property valued at $4.1 million. Charles glanced at the document without picking it up, his expression revealing nothing, but his fingers drummed once against the table surface, a tiny tell that suggested I'd just shared information he hadn't expected me to possess. "Your wife has been busy," I said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather instead of financial arrangements that could destabilize his marriage. I slid additional documents across the table. Corporate filings showing Patricia's ownership stakes in companies Charles had funded through his venture capital firm. Property records revealing her shell company purchases throughout Boston's most exclusive neighborhoods. Charitable foundation reports that showed how cleverly she'd positioned herself at the center of the city's philanthropic power structure. "She's brilliant," I continued, genuine admiration creeping into my voice. "I mean that sincerely. The way she's leveraged her position as your wife to build her own empire while maintaining the facade of being a traditional society hostess, it's actually masterful." Charles finally picked up one of the documents, a loan agreement bearing his own signature. His company had extended the mortgage on Patricia's family property, secured at favorable terms that any other borrower would have killed for. Nothing illegal, nothing even particularly unusual for a family transaction. Just smart financial planning between spouses who trusted each other completely. Charles set down the document and leaned back in his chair, his full attention now focused on me with laser intensity. "What exactly are you suggesting, Allison?" This was the moment, the point where I either played my hand or folded entirely. Patricia Manning had counted on me being too emotionally devastated to fight back, too financially insignificant to pose a real threat, too intimidated by the Manning family's power to risk their displeasure. She'd been wrong on all 3 counts. "I'm not suggesting anything," I said, maintaining eye contact with the man who could destroy his wife's carefully constructed empire with a single phone call to his legal department. The corner of Charles's mouth twitched upward, barely visible, but unmistakably genuine. He was enjoying this conversation, despite himself, appreciating the subtlety of an approach that gave him plausible deniability while making the implications crystal clear. And why would you think I'd find this particular information interesting? I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make him mirror the movement. Because Patricia used your company as the mortgage holder for her family property without fully disclosing how extensively she was leveraging that loan for other business ventures.
Because she's been using her position as your wife to negotiate deals with companies in your investment portfolio, and because she destroyed my wedding to protect what she saw as threats to her carefully maintained power structure. The words hung between us like smoke from an extinguished candle. Charles Manning was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. He could see exactly how his wife had used their marriage as both shield and weapon, protecting her business interests while eliminating perceived threats to her influence. "That's quite an accusation," he said finally. "It's not an accusation at all," I replied. "It's just data, facts that exist in public records for anyone who knows where to look and has legitimate business reasons for looking." Charles picked up another document, this one showing Patricia's involvement in a real estate deal that had coincidentally occurred right after his venture capital firm had invested in a property development company. The timeline was suspicious, but not necessarily inappropriate. The pattern, however, suggested a level of coordination that went far beyond coincidental family business discussions. "You know what I find most interesting about all of this?" Charles said, his voice taking on the same tone he probably used in board meetings when he was about to make a point that would reshape everyone's understanding of the situation. "What's that?" "Patricia told me you'd called her the night before the wedding, said you were having second thoughts, worried about whether you were ready for marriage. She presented herself as the protective mother-in-law who was simply trying to spare everyone the embarrassment of a public breakdown." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Patricia hadn't just destroyed my wedding, she'd constructed an entire alternative narrative to explain her actions, a story that positioned her as the caring family protector rather than the calculating architect of my humiliation. "That conversation never happened," I said. "I know." Charles's response was immediate, matter-of-fact, devastating. Because Patricia was with me that entire evening. We were at a charity auction for the Children's Hospital, surrounded by 300 witnesses who could testify that she never left my side long enough to take a private phone call. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Charles had known from the beginning that his wife had lied about her reasons for canceling the wedding. He'd known that Patricia had orchestrated the entire disaster while constructing a false narrative to cover her tracks. And he'd said nothing, done nothing, allowed his son to believe that I'd been the one with cold feet. "You knew she was lying," I said, not quite able to keep the accusation out of my voice. Charles nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Patricia has many admirable qualities, but honesty has never been her strongest suit, especially when she believes she's protecting the family's interests." "And you were okay with that? Is she destroying my relationship with David based on a complete fabrication?" For the first time since he'd arrived, Charles Manning looked genuinely uncomfortable. He glanced around the coffee shop, perhaps regretting his choice of venue for a conversation that was rapidly becoming more personal than either of them had anticipated. "I built my fortune by choosing my battles carefully," he said finally. "Patricia wanted you gone from David's life, and she was prepared to use whatever methods she deemed necessary to achieve that goal. Fighting her would have meant choosing between my wife and my son's girlfriend, and that seemed like a war with no winners." The casual dismissal of my relationship as merely son's girlfriend stung more than I'd expected. 4 years of shared holidays, business discussions, genuine affection, reduced to a temporary inconvenience that wasn't worth fighting for. But Charles Manning hadn't finished talking. "However," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper,
Patricia made one significant miscalculation in her campaign to remove you from our family. What's that? Charles smiled, and for the first time I'd known him, the expression looked genuinely predatory. She assumed that destroying your relationship with David would be sufficient to neutralize you as a threat. She never considered that some connections transcend romance, and some betrayals demand consequences that go far beyond broken hearts. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. Charles Manning, billionaire tech mogul and patriarch of one of Boston's most powerful families, was telling me that he'd been planning his own form of retaliation against his wife's manipulations. What are you saying? I'm saying that Patricia used my company to leverage her family property for business ventures I was never fully informed about. I'm saying that she's created potential conflicts between her investments and my portfolio companies. And I'm saying that as the primary decision maker for Manning Venture Capital, I have both the authority and the responsibility to address those conflicts. Charles stood up from the table, leaving the financial documents spread between us like evidence at a crime scene. Thank you for bringing these discrepancies to my attention, Allison. I'll have my legal team review everything thoroughly. He paused, his hand resting on the back of his chair, and looked down at me with something that might have been affection or might have been respect. For what it's worth, I think Patricia made a serious error in judgment. David was lucky to have you, and she was too blinded by her own prejudices to see what an asset you would have been to this family. Then he walked away, leaving me alone with the ruins of Patricia Manning's secret empire spread across a coffee shop table like a roadmap to her destruction. I sat there for another 20 minutes, watching graduate students studying for finals and freelancers typing furiously on laptops that had seen better days. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that they'd just witnessed the planning stages of what would probably be the most expensive divorce in Boston's recent history. Patricia Manning had played a perfect game of manipulation and control, eliminating threats and protecting her interests with surgical precision. She just hadn't realized that the biggest threat to her carefully constructed world was sitting across the breakfast table from her every morning, and that he'd been watching her moves far more carefully than she'd ever imagined.
The war she'd started by destroying my wedding was about to become a battle she couldn't possibly win. The call came at 6:15 on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after my conversation with Charles at Café Luna. I'd been expecting it, but the timing still caught me off guard. Patricia Manning wasn't the type to lose her composure before her morning yoga session and green juice breakfast. The fact that she was calling at dawn suggested that Charles had moved faster than either of us had anticipated. "You manipulative little bitch." Patricia's voice carried none of its usual polished restraint. No pretense of civility, no carefully modulated tone designed to make insults sound like compliments, just raw fury crackling through the phone like electricity. I sat up in bed, instantly alert, despite having been dead asleep 30 seconds earlier. "Good morning to you too, Patricia." "Don't you dare play innocent with me. I know exactly what you did." I padded to my kitchen and started the coffee maker, grateful for the routine as my heart hammered against my ribs. 3 weeks of waiting for this moment hadn't prepared me for the actual sound of Patricia Manning's world crumbling in real time. "I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific. I've done quite a few things lately." "You went to Charles with my private financial information. You poisoned him against me with your pathetic little revenge fantasy." The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling my apartment with the rich aroma of French roast and the promise of caffeine-fueled clarity. Actually, I shared publicly available information with someone who had legitimate business concerns about potential conflicts of interest, but I can understand how you might see that as poisoning. Patricia's laugh was like breaking glass. Publicly available, as if any normal person would spend weeks digging through property records and corporate filings just to satisfy some petty grudge. "You'd be surprised what people can accomplish when they're properly motivated," I said, pouring coffee into my favorite mug, the one David had brought me from a conference in Seattle, back when we'd thought we had a future worth commemorating with souvenir dishware.
Charles served me with papers yesterday morning, Patricia continued, her voice dropping to something closer to a hiss. Loan acceleration, full payment due within 30 days, or the property goes into foreclosure proceedings. The words hit me like a physical impact. Charles hadn't just reviewed the documents I'd provided, he'd weaponized them with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades in corporate warfare. Calling in Patricia's mortgage wasn't just a financial move, it was a surgical strike designed to destroy the foundation of her power base. That must have been quite a shock, I said, working to keep my voice neutral even as satisfaction bloomed in my chest like a warm flower. $3.2 million, Allison, due in full by December 15th. Do you have any idea what that means? I did, actually. It meant Patricia would have to liquidate her carefully assembled portfolio of investments to save her family's legacy property. It meant exposing the full extent of her shadow empire to generate the cash Charles was demanding. It meant choosing between her business interests and her social standing, between her financial independence and her family's four-generation history in one of Boston's most prestigious addresses. It means you'll need to make some difficult decisions, I said. It means Charles is destroying our marriage to satisfy your wounded ego. The accusation hung between us like smoke from a house fire. Patricia Manning, master manipulator and architect of social destruction, was reduced to blaming her marital problems on the woman she'd dismissed as inconsequential just 3 weeks earlier. Your marriage problems started long before I came into the picture, I said, settling onto my couch with my coffee and the morning sunlight streaming through my windows. Context. Patricia spat the word like it tasted bitter. You provided him with ammunition. You turned my husband against me because you couldn't handle losing gracefully. Losing gracefully? I repeated the phrase, tasting its implications. Is that what you thought would happen? That I'd accept your little character assassination and disappear quietly into whatever corner of the world you thought I belonged in? I thought you'd take your $50,000 and move on with your life. I thought you'd recognize that you were outmatched and act accordingly. There it was, the fundamental miscalculation that had led to Patricia's current crisis. She'd approached our conflict like a chess game where she controlled all the pieces, never considering that her opponent might be playing an entirely different game with entirely different rules. The problem with people like you, I said, is that you assume everyone else thinks like you do. You assumed I'd prioritize money over principle, that I'd choose financial security over justice, that I'd care more about avoiding conflict than about holding you accountable for what you did. What did I did? Patricia's voice climbed an octave. I protected my family from a gold-digging opportunist who was using my son to climb the social ladder. Everything I did was justified. You destroyed my wedding based on a lie you told your own son. You humiliated me in front of 200 people because you thought I wasn't good enough for your family's precious bloodline. You orchestrated one of the most devastating days of my life because you could, because you had the power to do it, and you thought there would be no consequences. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the Cambridge street where I'd rebuilt my life from the ashes of Patricia's manipulation. The coffee shop where I now work most mornings, surrounded by other entrepreneurs and freelancers who understood that success meant more than inherited wealth and social connections. The bookstore where I'd spent countless hours reading about strong women who'd faced down much worse than a snobbish mother-in-law with delusions of grandeur. There are always consequences, Patricia. You just don't usually have to face them because most people don't have the resources or the motivation to fight back. You picked the wrong target this time. You think Charles will actually follow through with this? Patricia's voice carried a note of uncertainty that she probably hadn't intended to reveal. You think he'll destroy his own wife over some girl he barely knows?
Some girl he barely knows. Even now, even with her world collapsing around her, Patricia couldn't bring herself to acknowledge that I'd earned Charles's respect through 4 years of genuine relationship building. That his decision to retaliate wasn't about protecting a stranger, but about holding his wife accountable for betraying his trust and manipulating their son. I think Charles Manning is exactly the kind of man who keeps his word, I said. When he tells you there will be consequences for breaking his trust, he means it. When he discovers that his wife has been leveraging their marriage for undisclosed business advantages while lying to their son about destroying an innocent woman's wedding, he responds accordingly. This isn't over. Patricia's voice had regained some of its usual venom, but underneath the threat, I could hear something I'd never associated with her before: fear. You may have won this battle, but you have no idea what you've started. The Manning family has resources you can't even imagine. The Manning family does, I agreed, but you're about to discover that Charles Manning's resources aren't automatically yours anymore, and your personal resources are about to be significantly reduced by a very large mortgage payment. I could hear Patricia breathing heavily on the other end of the line, probably calculating and recalculating her options while standing in the kitchen of the townhouse she might lose within a month. The irony was almost perfect. The woman who destroyed my wedding day was spending her morning contemplating the destruction of her own carefully constructed life. You know what the funny thing is? I said, settling back onto my couch with my coffee. If you'd just accepted me as David's choice, if you'd treated me with basic human decency instead of orchestrating my humiliation, none of this would have happened. You created your own worst-case scenario by trying to prevent something that was never actually a threat. David is better off without you, Patricia said, but the words sounded automatic, rehearsed, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. Maybe he is, I admitted, but that should have been his decision to make, not yours. You stole his agency, Patricia. You manipulated your own son because you thought you knew better than he did about what would make him happy, and now you're paying the price for that arrogance. The line went quiet for so long that I thought she might have hung up. When Patricia finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. What do you want? The question I'd been waiting for. The moment when Patricia Manning, social architect and family manipulator, finally acknowledged that she was no longer controlling the conversation. I want you to understand something, I said. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it for justice. There's a difference. Justice? She said the word like it was a foreign concept. Justice means that actions have consequences. It means that people who abuse their power get held accountable by someone with the authority to do something about it. It means that sometimes the universe has a sense of balance, even when it takes a while to manifest. I finished my coffee and set the mug on my dining table next to the folder of documents that had changed everything. Your husband is a good man, Patricia. He deserved to know the truth about what you did and why you did it. He deserved to understand how you'd been using his company and his trust to build your own empire while manipulating your family's relationships. And David? Her voice cracked slightly on her son's name. What about David in all of this? It was the first time Patricia had shown any concern for her son's well-being, rather than just her own position. Maybe the impending loss of her townhouse was providing some much-needed perspective on what actually mattered. David made his choice, I said. He chose to believe your lies rather than fight for our relationship. That's not something I can fix for him, and it's not something you can undo by calling me names at 6 a.m. This will destroy our family. Your family was already damaged by the lies and manipulation. Charles is just choosing to stop pretending otherwise. Patricia Manning hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone in my sunlit apartment with the satisfaction of a job well done and the strange emptiness that came with winning a war I'd never wanted to fight. Outside my window, Cambridge was waking up to another ordinary Friday morning. Students heading to early classes, commuters grabbing coffee before catching the T downtown, normal people living normal lives without billionaire in-laws or canceled weddings or mortgage payments that could buy small countries. I looked at my phone, half expecting it to ring again with either Patricia's continued fury or Charles's updates on the legal proceedings. Instead, I had 3 missed calls from Jessica and a text message from my sister asking if I'd seen the Boston Globe's Society page that morning. I grabbed my laptop and navigated to the paper's website, scanning the headlines until I found what Carmen was referring to. Manning Foundation announces organizational restructuring.
The article was diplomatic in the way that society page journalism always was when reporting on the personal disasters of prominent families, but the implications were clear. Patricia Manning was being systematically removed from her positions of influence while Charles consolidated control of their shared business interests. It was elegant, efficient, and absolutely devastating. Charles wasn't just calling in his wife's mortgage, he was dismantling her entire power structure with the precision of someone who'd spent decades understanding exactly how to disrupt complex systems. My phone buzzed with an incoming call. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. Allison Rodriguez. Miss Rodriguez, this is Margaret Fairchild from Fairchild and Associates. I represent Charles Manning in certain business matters. A lawyer. Charles was having his lawyer call me, which could mean either very good news or very bad news depending on how he'd decided to handle the aftermath of Patricia's financial unraveling. How can I help you, Miss Fairchild? Mr. Manning would like to extend an invitation for lunch next Tuesday at his downtown office. He has a business proposition he'd like to discuss with you. A business proposition? Not an apology for his wife's behavior, not an attempt to negotiate some kind of family peace treaty, but actual business. Charles Manning wanted to talk to me about work?
What kind of business proposition? I'm not at liberty to discuss the details over the phone, but I can tell you that it involves a significant expansion of his marketing initiatives and a leadership position that would utilize your specific skill set and industry experience. A job offer. Charles Manning was offering me a job while simultaneously destroying his wife's financial empire and restructuring his family foundation to remove her influence. It was the kind of power move that either demonstrated incredible confidence or represented the opening salvo in a much larger war. Tell Mr. Manning, I said. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of Patricia Manning's downfall, and contemplated the strange trajectory that had brought me from canceled bride to potential business partner with one of Boston's most powerful men. 3 weeks ago, Patricia had thought she was removing a threat to her family's social standing. Instead, she'd created her own replacement and handed her husband a legitimate reason to question everything about their marriage. Justice, as it turned out, had a sense of irony that even I hadn't anticipated. The 42nd floor of the Manning Tower offered a view of Boston that made the city look like an architect's scale model, all gleaming glass and calculated angles stretching toward a horizon that seemed infinite from this height. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows in Charles Manning's corner office, watching rush-hour traffic navigate the streets below like blood cells moving through arteries, and tried to process how dramatically my life had changed in the 4 weeks since Patricia had destroyed my wedding. Impressive view, Charles said from behind his desk, where he'd been reviewing what looked like legal documents with the focused intensity of someone dismantling an empire one contract at a time. I never get tired of it. Reminds me how far I've come from that dorm room at MIT where I wrote my first lines of code. I turned from the window to face him, noting how relaxed he seemed despite the fact that he was presumably in the process of financially destroying his wife of 20 years. Charles Manning in his natural habitat was a different creature entirely from the diplomatic family patriarch I'd known through David. Here, surrounded by the visible proof of his success, he radiated the quiet confidence of someone who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve through strategic thinking and superior resources. Thank you for seeing me, I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. Your lawyer was intriguingly vague about the specifics of your proposition. Charles smiled, the expression carrying genuine warmth along with something that might have been respect. Margaret Fairchild has many talents, but marketing isn't one of them. She thinks business propositions should be discussed in person, preferably with multiple witnesses and detailed documentation. He closed the legal folder he'd been reviewing and gave me his complete attention. How are you handling everything, Allison? Really, not the polite answer you'd give at a cocktail party. The question caught me off guard with its directness. Charles Manning wasn't known for small talk or emotional check-ins. He was asking because the answer mattered to whatever he was planning to propose. Better than I expected, I said honestly. The first week was rough, a lot of anger, a lot of questioning everything I thought I knew about your family.
But anger is useful if you channel it correctly. And how did you channel it? Research, planning, understanding the difference between emotional revenge and strategic justice. I gestured toward the city spread out below us. I learned that sometimes the best way to handle bullies is to hand them enough rope to hang themselves. Charles laughed, a sound that contained genuine delight. Patricia would be furious if she knew you'd just called her a bully. She sees herself as a sophisticated strategist protecting her family's interests. What does Patricia see herself now? I asked, curious about how the woman who'd orchestrated my humiliation was handling her own unraveling. Betrayed, abandoned, shocked that actions have consequences when those consequences are enforced by someone with actual power. Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. She's also broke. The mortgage payment is due in 18 days, and liquidating her portfolio is proving more complicated than she anticipated. The satisfaction I felt at Patricia's financial crisis was tempered by genuine curiosity about the family dynamics at play. How is David handling all of this? David is learning some uncomfortable truths about his mother's character and his own complicity in her manipulations. Charles's voice carried a note of disappointment that suggested this education was long overdue. He's also discovering that choosing the path of least resistance isn't actually a strategy for long-term happiness. Meaning he's been calling your phone number for the past week, despite the fact that you're not answering. The information hit me like a small electric shock. David was trying to reach me, probably prompted by guilt or family pressure or some combination of both. Part of me was curious about what he might want to say, but a larger part recognized that ship had sailed when he'd chosen to believe his mother's lies rather than fight for our relationship. I'm not interested in rehashing the past with David, I said. Whatever apology or explanation he thinks he owes me, it's too late to matter. I hoped you'd say that, Charles replied, his approval evident, because the business proposition I want to discuss would be significantly complicated with ongoing emotional entanglements with my son. Business proposition. I'd been wondering about the specifics since his lawyer's call, trying to imagine what kind of professional opportunity Charles Manning might offer to the woman his wife had tried to destroy. Manning Venture Capital is expanding our marketing and communications division, Charles began, shifting into what I recognized as his boardroom voice. We're moving beyond traditional tech investments into biotech, clean energy, and emerging markets that require more sophisticated public relations strategies.
He pulled out a different folder, this one containing what looked like organizational charts and budget projections. I need someone to lead that expansion, someone who understands both the technical aspects of marketing strategy and the personal dynamics of working with high-stakes personalities. I stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a career. Senior Vice President of Strategic Communications, 6-figure salary, plus equity participation in our investment outcomes, complete autonomy over your department's operations, and a budget that would make most marketing directors weep with joy. The terms he was describing represented everything I'd worked toward in my entrepreneurial career, the kind of position that would establish me as a serious player in Boston's business community rather than just another consultant scrambling for clients. It was also clearly designed to position me as a permanent fixture in Charles Manning's professional orbit, which meant a permanent reminder to Patricia of exactly how badly she'd miscalculated. This is about more than just my qualifications, I said. Of course it is. Charles's honesty was refreshing after years of navigating Patricia's coded communications and social subtleties. I'm offering you this position because you're exceptionally qualified and because you've demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking I value in my senior staff. I'm also offering it because Patricia needs to understand that destroying people has consequences, and sometimes those consequences involve watching your victim become more successful than you ever imagined possible. The brutal efficiency of his logic was breathtaking. Charles wasn't just offering me a job, he was recruiting me as a living symbol of his wife's failure, a daily reminder that her manipulations had backfired spectacularly. What happened to Patricia? I asked. Patricia will have to make some difficult choices about her priorities.
Charles's voice carried no emotion, as if he were discussing a business competitor rather than his wife of 2 decades. She can liquidate her investments to save the townhouse, which will destroy her financial independence but preserve her social standing. Or she can default on the mortgage and maintain her business portfolio while losing the family property that's been the foundation of her identity for 15 years. And your marriage? Charles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the windows and the city beyond. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that suggested this conversation had been inevitable for years. My marriage has been a business partnership disguised as a love story for longer than I care to admit. Patricia married me for my potential, and I married her for her connections and social intelligence. It worked well enough when our interests aligned, but we've been moving in different directions for years. He turned back to me, his expression resolute. What she did to you was unforgivable, not because of the personal hurt she caused, but because of what it revealed about her character. She's become someone who destroys people for sport, and I can't pretend that's acceptable anymore. The weight of what he was telling me settled into the space between us. Charles Manning wasn't just offering me a job or even executing revenge against his wife. He was using Patricia's attack on me as justification for ending a marriage that had probably been dying slowly for years. I need time to think about this, I said. Of course, though I should mention that Margaret Fairchild will be filing divorce papers on my behalf next Monday morning. Patricia doesn't know yet, which means you have roughly 4 days to decide whether you want to be employed by her soon-to-be ex-husband when she finds out. The timeline was aggressive, clearly designed to maximize Patricia's shock and minimize her ability to mount any kind of counterattack. Charles Manning was applying the same ruthless efficiency to ending his marriage that he'd used to build his business empire. One more question, I said, standing to leave. Why me? You could hire any marketing executive in the country for this position. Why choose the woman your wife tried to destroy? Charles smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, the expression looked genuinely predatory. Because hiring you accomplishes 3 goals simultaneously. I get the best possible person for the job, I send a clear message about the consequences of crossing my family, and I ensure that Patricia has to see your success every time she reads the business section of the Boston Globe. That's quite a chess move. I prefer to think of it as poetry. 3 days later, I stood in my bathroom mirror, wearing a navy blue power suit that had cost more than my rent, preparing for my first day as Senior Vice President of Strategic Communications for Manning Venture Capital. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia Manning's attempt to remove me from her family's orbit had resulted in my becoming more professionally connected to them than marriage to David ever would have accomplished. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica. Saw the announcement in the Globe. Patricia Manning must be having an aneurysm. Call me when you get a chance. Carmen wants to plan a celebration party. I smiled, thinking about how my sister would react to the news that I'd gone from canceled bride to corporate executive in less than 2 months. Carmen had always believed that the best revenge was living well, and this particular version of living well had the added satisfaction of being architected by Patricia's own husband. Another text came through, this one from an unknown number. Allison, please call me. I need to explain everything. I was wrong about so many things. David. I deleted the message without responding. David Manning belonged to a previous chapter of my life, one that had ended when he'd chosen to believe his mother's lies rather than fight for our relationship. Whatever guilt or regret he was experiencing now wasn't my responsibility to absolve. The final message was from Charles. Looking forward to working with you. The first board meeting is at 10 a.m. Patricia won't be attending. She's apparently busy with real estate matters. I laughed out loud, imagining Patricia's reaction to discovering that her husband had not only filed for divorce, but had hired her nemesis as a senior executive in his company. The woman who thought she was eliminating a social climbing gold digger had inadvertently created her own replacement in both her husband's business and eventually his personal life.
Not that I had any romantic interest in Charles Manning, but I understood now why Patricia had been so determined to remove me from their family sphere. I represented everything she feared, someone with genuine intelligence, authentic ambition, and the kind of strategic thinking that didn't require manipulation or social positioning to be effective. I grabbed my briefcase and headed for the door, ready to begin the career that Patricia Manning's cruelty had accidentally made possible. The woman who destroyed my wedding had unknowingly given me something far more valuable, the opportunity to build the kind of professional success that no one could ever take away. Outside, Boston stretched before me like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Somewhere in Beacon Hill, Patricia Manning was probably staring at foreclosure notices and divorce papers, finally understanding that some battles create consequences far beyond anything the original combatants intended. She'd wanted to teach me a lesson about knowing my place in the world. Instead, she'd learned that sometimes the people you underestimate have the power to reshape your entire reality. Justice, as it turned out, had a sense of humor after all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.